Right, okay. I'm going to get started because we've got some great panelists who are going to be talking to you today. So welcome everyone. I can't see you all, so I'm just going to smile, roughly in your direction. But I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to this session. My name's Lucy, and I work as a food power mentor in the Northwest. And I'm delighted to introduce you to Dr. Hannah Lambie-Mumford from the University of Sheffield, who's going to be speaking today, and also Chris Gibbon-Walsh, who's from FareShare and the Voluntary and Community Sector Emergency Partnership. And then we've also got Simon from Sustain, who's on the call and is going to be managing all of the technical stuff. So if anything goes wrong, message him, please. We will be talking through the issues that have been raised around the responses to COVID, etc. And there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Now, if anybody's unfamiliar with Zoom and you just want to have a little look down the bottom, you will see along the bottom of your screen, there is an option for Q&A, and that's where we'd like you to put any questions that you have. If you want to chat away in the chat away. But in that's where we want the questions in Q&A, because that way we won't lose them in the conversation. And finally, just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be made available to everybody probably in another week or so once everything's been pulled together. So welcome to everyone, and I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who is going to talk to you about the responses and insights of food vulnerability during COVID-19 research project that she's been carrying out, and she will be looking at the learning on 4 key interventions. So over to you, Hannah, please.
Thank you ever so much, Lucy. Hello to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to just share my screen. And I've got just a couple of slides. Hopefully you can see those okay. And Lucy, if I press the slideshow, is that okay? Can you see that?
Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm really pleased to have been invited to speak to you today about our ongoing research project looking at responses to risks of food insecurity over the COVID crisis. I've seen a quick look at the participants. Some of you were in the earlier session with CAP, where we saw a fireside chat with some people from one of the elements of our project. So I'll put them, I'll set it out in a little bit of a second. Sorry, the slides moved on then without my awareness, so apologies. So I'm Hannah Lambie-Mumford from the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. My colleague Katie Gordon is in the webinar with us as well today, who's a lead researcher on the project, and Rachel Loopstra from King's College London co-leads the research. And we're working with partners Sustain and Church Action on Poverty on a number of aspects of the project. So the aims of the research are to map and monitor responses to risks of food insecurity over the crisis. So we're doing this with 3 key elements. The first is a national element, which is what I'm talking to you about today. So we're working with national policymakers and national organisations to map and monitor the responses we saw at a national level. And that's UK-wide, but also devolved in the 4 nations of the UK. And the session focus that I'm just going to talk through a bit about today looks at the responses that we saw last year, March to August, in that first lockdown, and some of the key learning from that. The second national level element that we have is the participatory policy panel that's being run with Church Action on Poverty. And that is a group of people who we heard bit from this morning with experience of food access issues over the COVID crisis, and many of them have also been involved in food activism over this time as well. And we've also got some local level case studies where we're studying 14 areas, and some of them have food power alliances within them, looking at the responses at a local level from local actors. So I'm going to talk today about the national level responses that we've been mapping and monitoring. And just to kind of rewind back to where we were last spring, when the COVID crisis hit, policymakers and other actors were particularly focused about the risk of food insecurity amongst 3 groups that they identified. So the first were those who were extremely clinically vulnerable and were asked to shield, including asking to avoid going out to shops and to get food. The moderately clinically vulnerable, who were asked to limit as much as possible contact outside their home, the so-called non-shielding vulnerable. And the third group were those who couldn't afford to access food but could have left their home. So financially vulnerable. I'm sorry, my PowerPoint's got a mind of its own and keeps jumping ahead, so forgive the jumping. The interventions that we're looking at in particular, that we're focused on now, are the replacements of school food provision when schools were closed, emergency finance schemes that were in operation, emergency food provision, and also the grocery box scheme for people who were shielding. So we'll be looking at those four across the 4 countries. And to say as well that we've published all of these findings in 2 reports that are available on the project website, which I will give you at the end as well. So my slides are quite text heavy because I thought it'd be useful for you to be able to look at them afterwards if you wanted some of the, rather than having to read the full reports. So the first intervention of significance that we identified was obviously the replacement of school food while schools were closed to most children, except those of key worker children and vulnerable children. So what was implemented then? So there was a huge variety across the UK, but also within the different countries of the UK. So in England, we saw food parcel provisions at schools, and also the voucher scheme that was run through the Department for Education in Edenred. In Scotland, we saw parcels, vouchers and direct payments. And one of the things that we observed there was a particular shift over time, where at the beginning of the lockdown, more in-kind food parcel provision, but an increasing shift towards cash replacements across local areas as the lockdown progressed. And in Wales, the notable difference here is that breakfast replacements were provided, because breakfast provision is obviously a right in Wales. So that was also added on to the replacement provision in Wales. Northern Ireland stands out particularly here amongst all of the countries, because direct payments to families were implemented immediately across the board in the country. So this is quite distinct from the other nations. So what we saw was a range of different approaches, much of this localised, so it's actually quite hard to capture what happened everywhere. Across the UK, our research identified amongst stakeholders concerns over the suitability of eligibility criteria and means testing and the ultimate reach of replacement schemes. There's been some fantastic work, particularly by CPAG, on the benefits and drawbacks of different kinds of provision across that time, and particularly highlighting the difficulties with food parcels in terms of people having to travel to pick up the food, contents not necessarily healthy or appropriate, the vouchers, similar issues with having to travel, the stigma of using vouchers to pay, restricted choices in where to shop and what to buy, in comparison to cash, which their research has really highlighted enables choice and flexibility. And it's really important, we argue, that these experiences inform ongoing policy debates about free school meals. The second intervention is emergency finance. So again, here there's some quite big differences across the 4 nations. So in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there were schemes in place across the countries. So the Scottish Welfare Fund, the Discretionary Assistance Fund in Wales, and the Discretionary Support COVID-19 Fund in Northern Ireland. Each of these had increased funding over that period, adapted criteria, or made more flexible. More people were eligible or could, for example, claim more times. In England, obviously, we don't have a national system of emergency finance, but more funding was given to councils to support people in ways they designed. So in terms of the rollout of this, it's really notable that there's limited evidence on the impact of these emergency payment schemes. And we're kind of still looking and trying to find, so if anyone here knows of any good data on these, we'd be really welcome to hear from you. Additional funding, the changes to eligibility and easier access mechanisms were widely welcomed by the stakeholders we have engaged with, although they were concerned about the real reach of the schemes and whether they was actually reaching people that really would need support at this time. So whether there was sufficient promotion and whether people who hadn't accessed this kind of support would have known it was available or how to get it. So the third intervention then is the ways in which charitable emergency food assistance really adapted over this time, and we'll hear from Chris in a minute. And obviously, there's been some incredible changes and shifts over this time. So just here on this slide, what I've done here is separate out the early weeks from the broader changes we saw over that wider period of time. So in sort of the immediate announcement of the lockdown, and obviously in amongst the various food supply issues that the country faced at that time, there was food supply changes and shifts, and access to food for some projects was significantly challenging. Also volunteer-based shielding, many projects found that their volunteers couldn't come into to work in the projects from the sort of straight away, and also the demand increasing significantly. But generally speaking, from March onwards, after those changes we saw, as well as that projects actually found that different people came forward to volunteer, and the food supply issues worked their way out one way or another over those few months. But generally what we've seen over that time is the landscape of provision changing. So meal projects that involve people coming together to eat within a building were repurposed, for example, to provide food parcels, and new projects popping up and still popping up. There were changes to access, so projects moving to delivering food parcels and food rather than people coming to collect them, or new or different referral processes, or some projects doing away with referral processes, and obviously supply and operations changing. So new forms of funding, for example, the government funding that came through, new kinds of support, for example, British Gas, and new sourcing, for example, joining FareShare. So what we found was the projects were highly responsive and made extensive adaptations, and really the scale of funding and the food that came through those networks is unprecedented. We saw obviously a heavy reliance on charitable emergency food assistance by government, so they were designated essential services and a core part of the response on the ground. And obviously, especially in the early weeks, obviously the crisis threatened the several of the well-established vulnerabilities in these systems, obviously the supply chains, the reliance on volunteers, and the challenges of meeting dramatic increases in need that we saw. So just to finish up, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say one more minute, Hannah.
Yeah, sorry, yes. And so just to sort of finish up with then the grocery box scheme for people that were shielding, if any of you can obviously remember that at the time. So England, Wales had a scheme that was just really designed for those on the shielding list. In Scotland, it was principally for those on the shielding list, but people in the household could also receive support if they needed it. In Northern Ireland, this box scheme was for both shielding and those facing financial barriers. Obviously, it was an unprecedented intervention, but there was lots of limitations to it. And I'm sure most of you who were working in that space at the time remember the issues with the food that was in the boxes, the confusion over who was available, who was eligible, and local authorities actually ending up working to supplement or supplant the national provision to make it more appropriate for people in their local communities. So there's lots we can learn from this intervention. There's some work coming out of Scotland, but more than that, you know, I think it's important that we do revisit it to know really what we can learn from that. So I'll end there. Those are the links for the reports and my email address if you would like it. Okay, stop sharing. Sorry, Lucy, went to the wire there.
No, that's brilliant. I tell you what, Hannah, could you possibly put your contact details into the chat as well, please? Just in case anybody didn't get a chance to write that down. And I liked also the fact that you were sort of asking for some evidence from people. So I'm sure that you'll probably get a few emails from people talking to you about how things worked in their local authority. I know that I will be contacting you about how things worked in Liverpool because I've got some insights to share with you. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on to Chris Gibbon-Walsh, who is the Director of Network, Community and Operations at FareShare. And we're going to hear from Chris his reflections on how the voluntary and community sector basically supported food access during this time and how we can develop a food security roadmap. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Lucy. What a lovely introduction. So hi, everyone. Happy Wednesday. So I have a few things that I wanted to share, but obviously we will then kind of get to a bit of a Q&A. I'm just going to share really quickly a bit of a presentation which I think might be useful. Hopefully you can all see that. Fab, Lucy, thank you. So
that's great, thank you.
I'm speaking as the kind of UK director at FareShare, but also I've been working with the Red Cross and a group of organisations, government, local council and not-for-profit across the multiple sectors that have been looking at the emergency response to food over the last 12-13 months. It was created, actually, the VCSEP Voluntary Sector Emergency Partnerships in response to Grenfell Tower and the Manchester bombings, but has also been a hosting space for collaboration, both locally and nationally, for organisations to come together and discuss different streams of work in response to the pandemic and the emergency that we've seen over the last 13 months. With that in mind, then, actually became really, really clear at the beginning of all of this work that we were all coming at it from different places. And so the problem itself wasn't clear because we were all talking about different aspects of the problem, which is relatively normal, but I think it became a really important thing that we'd all noticed. So whether it's Frost & Frost and the Independent Food Bank Network and their work on food aid, whether it's Vouchers or Salvation Army or British Red Cross or whoever, we were all looking at slightly different aspects of this. And the first thing that we needed to do was identify exactly what was going on, the problem we wanted to resolve, and where each of us sat across that problem. So the first thing that was identified was actually language was a real barrier. So there was a lot of people talking about food insecurity, there was a lot of people talking about poverty, and there was a lot of people talking about asset-based community development. They are all slightly different, but they overlap. And therefore the responses to each are also slightly different. And so at the same time, as a sector and with government, because of the difference in language and because actually there's a lot of noise in the sector, there's a lot of different campaigns, there's a lot of different asks of government or different sectors to respond to the problem, it wasn't clear whether there was actually a prioritized list of what we should be doing and in what order, where we should be prioritizing our resources, our money, whether it be government or not-for-profit, to really solve these three problems of poverty, food insecurity, and community resilience.
Chris,
Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you able to speak a little more clearly? There's people are struggling to hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
Brilliant, thank you.
I don't know whether that's
a bit better if you move a bit closer. Thank you.
in.
Sorry to interrupt your flow.
That's okay, Lucy. So overall, this was about growing number of people locked in hardship. A lot of the things that Hannah's just been talking about. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this slide because I think Hannah has wonderfully summarized it already. However, what I am going to talk a little bit about is this language position, which is about just understanding the differential between poverty, an economics issue, household food insecurity, an access issue, partly to do with economics, but not only. Also, there being physical barriers, as Hannah spoke about before, around people who were shielding or vulnerable. And that's not just in the pandemic, it was the case beforehand too. But it's not as simple as to say household food insecurity is only about economics. It's not. It's also about access to the right types of food everywhere. So that's about solving food deserts. It's about having nutrition at the right price in the right way. It's about education to support people to be able to use different ingredients in a way that suits them, etc. Poverty is about cash, as Hannah talked about, and wages and structural issues, as well as about kind of solving what's right in front of us through food banking movements and food aid, for example. And then actually where Fair Share fits into all of this, normally, maybe not over the last 12 months, is that Fair Share is very much a community development organisation using surplus food as an asset for communities to use. And those communities then might interact with the symptoms of poverty or household food insecurity, but it's not about trying to solve poverty with surplus food. Absolutely not. That is, we can't solve poverty with food, never mind with surplus food. And so community development then is essentially the more cathartic or positive element of this space, but actually most of us have got dragged into the food aid space, the direct delivery of food without the auxiliary services, because people haven't been able to come together. But what we've still seen, and again, Hannah touched on this previously, is that, for example, where schools were running lunch clubs, they started to run pantries. And those pantries would then go to the doorsteps of the parents who might have been struggling. And by providing a bag of food to people who were shielding or known to be shielding, they were then able to have conversations on the doorstep that opened up questions and conversations about children, about education, about other areas that they hadn't have been able to have in the school context. And so using the community infrastructure as part of the council solution and the government solution locally nearly always had a positive impact, rather than bypassing that community infrastructure and trying to deal with it in isolation. That community infrastructure exists in nearly every part of the UK. And the better known it is, and the better we're able to utilize it, the more we're able to really deliver community resilience in its real terms nationally, by using national infrastructure and local infrastructure in a really unified way. And that didn't happen everywhere, again, as Hannah alluded to. The other thing that we talked about was, what are the key statistics? Again, in this sector and within government, we talk about all kinds of different information all the time. And when I speak to MPs or government, they say to me, I've been told a different statistic yesterday, and I'm confused about what poverty is, what household food insecurity is, etc. And this is about trying to, as a sector, come back to using common language, common statistics, common information that we're able to then, with brutal objectivity, try and really understand and solve the problem, rather than talk about what our chunk of it is. So it's to try and have this roadmap or central landscape through which everybody else's work can connect to, rather than to try and own the space. And so here are the 5 statistics that the group's come up with. I'm sure they will be refined over time. I'm sure information like the stuff that Hannah's presented will really help us to refine these. But actually what we wanted to talk about was the number of people who are locked in poverty, the number of people who are working, but are still struggling to afford food and kind of manage their day-to-day bills, the number of people who are in Black and minority ethnic households who are living in poverty, by the way, which is nearly half. These things demonstrate structural problems that need to be solved structurally, not just through crisis management. And so, again, in terms of the recommendations, it helps us to really zone in on what are the kind of things that we need to resolve. Wages, housing, all of the kind of structural elements, as well as food and cash grants and everything else. And it's only those things that will really help us to manage crises in the future. Thank you, Lucy. And just lastly then, what are the key messages that as a sector we should be thinking about? And again, to that point of, we all say different things to people, and for people who don't work in this sector, that can be very, very confusing, especially for the government. And it means that we don't then have a commonality that the government can really understand what exactly the things that should happen to solve the problem if as a sector we're saying a lot of different things. And so with the group, we came up with these relatively simple messages, which is a lot of this is about structural problems. So food aid is a temporary patch, and that's fine. It's important in the short term, but actually long term, we need to think much bigger. We need to think about wages and jobs and ways of helping people not be in that problem in the first place. We need to look at long-term structural change as the best way of making sure that people don't have to be in poverty in the first place or struggle with household food insecurity, and that communities have the assets they need to be able to develop and be resilient when crises occur in the future. And also that communities have a massive part to play here. Community empowerment is crucial. And actually, we can't do this by national organisations dictating how it works locally. It just won't work. We need to work together with those communities and make sure they have the asset skills that they need to be able to respond in crises. So I'll leave it there, Lucy.
You could see I was getting ready to jump on you. No, that was brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you very much, Hannah. I'm sure everybody will agree that that was both interesting and insightful from both of them. In particular, I'm really interested in the key messages that you finished on there, and I 100% agree with you that if we can't keep putting the sticking plaster on, we've got to make some changes. So I think we've got some questions that are coming through. So the first one I think is more of a general one, and that's about understanding what vouchers specifically work. Now, I'm not sure if this is vouchers for schools or if this is vouchers that were given for shielding adults, or what that would be exactly, but would either of you like to explain? Maybe Hannah, we'll start with you, what your understanding of vouchers being given out to people covers.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk. Actually, it's a good point, because I just assumed it was the school one. Sorry. Do you mind if I just talk to that, just as that was what my slide was on? Because I wouldn't know so much about the others. I mean, on the school replacement vouchers, it's actually it's quite hard to know. As I said before, oh wait, there's been a reply in school. Perfect. Yeah, thanks for coming back on that question. Yeah, so because some schools ran their own voucher scheme, so we don't know exactly what the full landscape to that voucher provision was, and what that looked like, how much that was for. In England, the Department for Education Eden Red scheme was run centrally, and schools could opt into that. There is, I will find it at some point and pop it into the chat here. There is the National Audit Office did a review of the voucher system that the Department for Education put in place, and that's a really great report. Actually, I would thoroughly recommend you having a look at that if you're interested, because there was a lot of issues with it. The main challenges with that system were around the administration of the vouchers, printing them off, getting them sorted, and originally there was such a limited number of supermarkets that people could use that was causing big problems with people actually not being able to get to those ones that people could access. So those were some of the main issues, but I'll try and find that report and stick it in the chat if you're interested. It's a really good read.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Chris, have you got anything to add to this? I know this is something that's quite interesting, this use of vouchers, because more and more there's a push towards going for cash rather than vouchers for a lot of reasons.
It's a good question. So there's two things. If you have a mechanism that isn't the mechanism that is normal, i.e. what we normally do is have cash. And so if you create a separate mechanism and you do it very, very quickly in an emergency, then two things happen. Firstly, not everyone at either interface, whether it be the retailer, schools, or the individual in question, knows how to use them, but also you just massively reduce dignity. So this idea that people will spend cash on other things other than food, maybe they will, but that's okay too, because people still need to commute to work or do all kinds of other things. By only making it about food, actually you've removed the ability for the individual to make decisions. And this is, again, comes back to education and kind of where we need to start. The second thing is that the retailers were very different in their ability to deliver the voucher program, and it's not necessarily what they're good at. They're good at taking cash and giving you products for it. So I'm really not into creating new and extra different things, because it was only done to make sure that people weren't spending that money on things other than food. And if I'm honest, that doesn't sit well with me. I understand why it was done, but I don't believe it was the right thing to do.
Of course, as of chair, I'm being very impartial, but yes, totally. Okay, I'm now going to go back to a question that's come through for Hannah particularly, which was about your presentation. And the question is about the types of interventions that came up in response to food vulnerability, the growth in the number of pantries or food hubs or whatever you might want to call across the UK. How is that changing landscape beginning to affect the responses that are coming through in your analysis?
Thank you. Thanks for that great question. So hold tight, because we're about to publish another deluge of reports from our local area case study work, which will talk a lot more about this side of things. So we've got the 14 local areas, and we've looked at the responses at that level where this theme is very much coming up. So at the national level, you know, it was kind of observed in a general sense, the changing landscapes locally, and we've been able to go in and see how this has operated in these areas across the whole UK. Pantries, yes, and the various terms used to describe them have been a theme in this changing landscape, certainly, along with the other kinds of informal support that was so and has continued to be so important, sort of neighbourhood support, you know, local one-to-one support as well. So we will be publishing that in the next couple of months, so watch out for that, and drop me an email if you'd like me to send it to you directly as hot off the press as soon as it goes live. And we will, and for the researchers amongst you here as well, just to shout out that we will be publishing some quite detailed descriptive accounts. So if you're interested in doing any secondary analysis of local case study data, we will be publishing quite a detailed level of our data. So our webpage will have all of that information, and you're welcome to contact us if you're interested in doing some of that secondary analysis too. We'd be keen to hear from you.
Oh, that's great. That's a really good offer. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you for replying to that. I've got another question, this time for Chris. This is from Rachel, saying that your app development has been amazing. So take that compliment. That's lovely. And it's been great in sharing surplus with businesses and charities. And she's asking, are there any plans to work on apps that could help charities manage their food and for end users more effectively, but also to sort of plan and record distribution and recording of data? Does that make sense?
It makes total sense to me. The answer is probably yes, but it's a significant piece of work. And as with all app development, it takes longer than I think it will. So, so that kind of thing we are absolutely exploring. Actually, we've just written our next 3-year strategy. In it, the charities that we work with are front and center, as you'd expect. And so providing not just food, but signposting support and all of the other things that we think we can alongside that will be an absolutely key part of our next kind of 3 years. I'd love you to reach out to me directly, actually, because I'd love to get your feedback on exactly what kind of thing could look into it, because we're already starting to explore what the next stage of development looks like, and could bring you into the user testing or user development if you'd be interested, because I certainly don't know best on this kind of thing. So
well, there's an open offer for anyone to contact Chris there if you've got suggestions
Lucy,
on how
I'd
to
also
develop
like
it.
to just touch on the last question around pantries,
Yes, please do.
So the two things that I'd like to just flag. One, again, language isn't useful here. So our definitions, but don't actually define what those organizations do, in the same way as a food bank doesn't define a food bank. Whether an organization gives out parcels or not for free, it's the services that go alongside it. It's the demographic that uses it. It's where it's located and how those services interact that are actually the key definitions of the service, rather than the name of it. And I think it's exactly the same for food, for pantries. So if you have a pantry that is alongside community kitchens and education facilities and employment and all kinds of other things, and has auxiliary services, that's completely different to people almost doing shopping like a grocery without any kind of auxiliary support. Now, auxiliary support can include social eating or social elements, but I think we need to be really careful that we don't just badge everything up to be the same. It isn't. And across the UK, I think what we need to be focusing on is, are the interventions in place there to not only deal with the short-term elements of household food insecurity or poverty, but also the structural symptoms of it in the first place, and community resilience. And I think that's about making sure that we're not only focusing on language or demonizing food banks or pantries. It's about making sure that those organizations are set up to be able to actually respond to the needs of the community.
Absolutely. Okay, I've now got two questions which are quite similar. So, and I'm going to put them to both of you, starting with Hannah. A question is coming in about culturally appropriate food, and also a request from somebody asking about faith organisations and how that works as well. And I was wondering, Rachel, have you had Rachel? Who's Rachel? Hannah, have you had any of that data coming through to you about that sort of area, about working with faith communities, working with culturally appropriate food, how that might be made more available and easily accessible for people?
Thanks for those. We haven't got in this current project, we have some level of that in some of our case studies, which we've not finalised and published yet. But as I said before, hopefully we'll be able to publish some of that when we finalise the data analysis on that. And obviously some of the kind of well-known problems with the difficulties with surplus food. In terms of practical answers to those, because I'm conscious I'm not the best place to do that, I probably would send over to Chris and also to the Sustain colleagues on their call, particularly in response to Rachel's question there about how their group can get involved in that campaign. I'd suggest maybe one of the Sustain team wanted to come in on that one, if that's all right.
Absolutely. No, I was just interested to know if it had featured at all in the data collection.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, not quite ready to whoop out those findings.
Fair enough. Okay,
Thank you.
I shall pass on to Chris then. Chris, do you have anything that you would like to add on this about, sort of culturally appropriate foods or making it easier for people from faith communities to access the foods that are right for them?
It comes back down to cash. And this is where two things. One, you have to have a range of community assets where food is only one of them. Surplus food is a small part of food being a community asset, never mind kind of the whole picture. And so I think it comes down to structures and making sure that when we talk about culturally appropriate food, actually the issue here is that we've got 50% of our Black and ethnic minorities in this country living in poverty. It's the structural issues that define the answer to this problem, not the food itself. The food itself, the answer is we need a wide enough range to be able to kind of provide that type of food to those communities for sure. But actually the real answer is we need to solve the structural problems that have created this question in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. I've got another question for Chris. Sorry, you're very popular boy today. About the contradictions and tensions between the dependency on surplus food and the same food industry linkages. I mean, I think this is a direction we're moving away from, and I think this goes more towards the idea that you're talking about, this sort of community kind of development of things for Fair Share, that you're not just about redistribution, you're doing other things as well.
Yeah, so again, this is really tricky, right? So Fair Share essentially sits in the middle of two broken systems. A food system that is outdated in many ways, but brilliant in others. The fact that we can just go to the shops and get whatever we want all the time is amazing. So we shouldn't, we can't just demonize what is actually available to us. The second thing, which is these structural elements that people don't have a way of accessing food, but actually where I come in on this is that even if everyone had all the food that they wanted, they might visit those services for other reasons. And if we can save those charities thousands of pounds on their food budgets through using that type of food rather than another type of food, then they reinvest that in other areas. That actually Fair Share is like a community investment organisation that uses that commodity and has a byproduct of environmentalism. And you can flip that around if you like, but that's how it works. In terms of the food industry themselves, it's very, very tricky, right? So if we're saying we won't work with you unless you pay living wage, for example, or unless you kind of only take from these kind of markets or whatever it is, no one would ever work with anyone. No charities would ever get any funding from anyone. And like if we hold the standards so high, nothing will happen. And so I think what we then need to do is say, how do we work together to kind of identify what the real problems are and what the potential solutions are? And how do we just make sure that we're not allowing greenwashing to happen? And I think that's where we need to hold our standards, which is around making sure that we're not allowing people to take credit for things that are actually, if we're honest, vanity projects rather than real solutions. And I think there's far too much of that.
Brilliant. Okay, so basically we need collaborative partnerships, and we also need to keep holding people slightly to account when they're doing the savior status kind of stuff.
Absolutely, but I also think if we've got to have our bar at the right level, because we can't. But you don't just change everyone's mind by bashing them over the head all the time.
No, completely agree with you on that. We've seen how that works. Right, I'm going to very slowly wrap up now because we're coming to the end of our session. So number one, I just wanted to say thank you very much to everybody for participating, and also to our two brilliant panelists who've talked through, explained things and answered questions in a brilliant way. There's been lots and lots of amazing information being shared in the chat, including one from Simon, just pointing out about the ways in which you can sign up to newsletters and find out more about things, etc. And I'm just going to highlight the fact that we've got 2 more festival sessions this afternoon. So we've got Connecting Food Poverty and Climate Change starting at 2:30. And then we've also got a lived experience cabaret, which sounds most intriguing, which will start at 5:15. And I know that in between that, there's also some sessions going on with different peer mentors around the spaces. So I would say go back to your programs, pick a session that you'd like to join. And thank you again so much, everybody, for taking part.